We know there are certain government policies that work better than other government policies. If we compare just in terms of inequality, if we compare just in terms of job growth, the 8 years of the Reagan administration and the 8 years of the Bill Clinton administration, what do we see?
Don't let anybody tell you that, it's corporations and businesses that create jobs. You know, that old theory, trickle-down economics. That has been tried. That has failed. It has failed rather spectacularly.
You think they're ethically and morally fit to be back in the White House as the first couple?
Listen, they're good people.
Laws have to be backed up with resources and political will, and deep-seated cultural codes, religious beliefs, and structural biases have to be changed.
Some people say, and at one point Jeb Bush's own mother said, come on, we got a big country. Can't we find anybody besides from these two families?
I understand.
What's your view of that?
It's a non-issue. You know, both of Mrs. Clinton and Jeb Bush are going to have to get through a primary process. As Jeb said, there's not going to be a coronation. He's going to have to go out there and earn it, and so is she. But if, in fact, the two of them earn it, people will get over this. And people will get over this. And
religious beliefs and structural biases have to be changed.
People will get over this. And
you know, Pew did a study and found 2/3 of those surveyed could not name the three branches of government. And I have to think that these two, Boehner and Clinton, cannot name the three branches of government. You're listening to The Resistance, Forrest Wilson. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Hillary Clinton. I don't have time today. There are much more important things to get to. But 2 out of 3 can't name the foundation of this republic. And you hear these politicians call this a democracy all the time. In fact, other radio shows hosts call this a democracy. It's not. It is a democratic republic with a small d. The point is representative government. 2 weeks ago, we talked about 10 pages a day, 10 pages an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week of new laws and regulations going on 365 days a year. That's 90,000 pages that our democratically elected representatives don't vote on. In fact, they don't contemplate it. They don't even see it in many cases. And I gave a label to it. It's bureaucratic despotism. Hillary Clinton is a bureaucratic despot. Anyways, if you wonder about the three branches of government, how they were established, it's the Constitution. And I'm going to offer you this book entitled Dynamic Freedoms. All you got to do is call the station. Jack will take your name and address. We're not going to send you anything other than this book. And you can share it with the 2/3 of America that absolutely wonders what the three branches of government are. This book includes the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and George Washington's farewell address. Let me tell you, if George was alive today, he'd lead a revolution against these bureaucratic despots like our current president, our current speaker, and Hillary Clinton, and many more of these Republicans. We could not have gotten here without the likes of John Boehner and Mitch McConnell. Did you hear Mitch McConnell on SRN News talking about the need for this? I guess they're calling it the Corker legislation with Lindsey Graham. Basically, it subverts the Constitution. You know, the Constitution already addresses the treaty process. Here it is. The president shall have the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. 2/3 of the senators present concur. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Again, if you don't have one, call me. I'll give you one. So Corker and Graham have subverted it with this legislation that basically gives them the opportunity to review it, and if they consent to it or agree to it with 60 votes, forget about those present, 60 votes, then the president can lift the sanctions against Iran. Look, I like what's in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. But instead, we're getting this watered down, mixed up, screwed up piece of legislation to subvert the Constitution, almost like what happens with the 500 agencies of the federal government that subvert you every single day and every single hour of every single year. They don't vote on these 90,000 pages of new rules and regulations, otherwise known as laws. They vote on about 3,600 pages a year, and of those 3,600, like the Affordable Care Act, we know they didn't read it. At least most of them didn't. 3,600 pages or whatever it was. Actually, I think it was 2,400 pages. But when was the last time you read something 2,400 pages long? Did you even do it in a year? The only point I'm making is this. Our Constitution was subverted a long time ago. Our republic was subverted a long time ago. And this Hillary Clinton, Jeb Bush, John Boehner, Mitch McConnell, they're subverting us, your liberty. And, you know, it almost doesn't matter. You don't hear me talk conservative, liberal, and all this stuff. And the reason I don't is because it almost doesn't matter what you think you are. It really matters what they think we are. And they think we're all a bunch of stupid serfs that are going to go along with whoever that one of the two major political parties throws up. And as for Jeb Bush and his act of love on this invasion, which, by the way, is also constitutional, we're supposed to put down an invasion. It doesn't mention the fact of it being armed or unarmed children or adults, men, women, or children. It simply says the word invasion, and we very much have an invasion going on in the southern border. And people like Jeb Bush are actually inciting an invasion by saying, oh, well, it's an act of love. And this is historical. I mean, if you look throughout history, certain things precipitate others. And I definitely believe that when a politician, a leader in this country stands up and says things like that, it increases the flow. It doesn't decrease the flow. And how does that, why do they put non-citizens above citizens? Where do we stand in this debate? The answer is you don't. In any event, I want you to call me if I can give you this book, Dynamic Freedoms. You know, I was listening to Mark Levin. I really like Mark Levin's show, and he summed up Hillary Clinton best. He said she speaks of income equality and strives for income equality. Income equality. Where has this been achieved? Where has income equality been achieved? And he goes on to say North Korea, Russia, China. Mao killed 40 to 60 million people in his quest for income equality. And it occurred to me, how many people is Miss Clinton in her third world dictator pantsuit? How many people is Miss Clinton willing to kill in her quest for income equality? This woman is a despot. I'll say it again. She's a bureaucratic despot. And she's headed for the White House. You know, she's been making alliances and receiving cash from all over the globe from America's sworn enemies, making deals with Russians, the Muslim Brotherhood. Hama Abedin, we talk about her a lot. She has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. Don't take my word for it. Look it up. Anyway, she's making these alliances with America's sworn enemies, making deals with these Russians, Muslim Brotherhood, and others, intent on taking your liberty and worse, your life. Look, this is real. This woman is a threat to what's left of the United States. Oh, but we'll make history. We'll have the first woman president. Worse. The history we will make, the history we will make, the history to be written about will be the destruction of the United States. The fact that she is a woman will be a footnote. But as I was saying, I don't want to get into any more of Hillary Clinton because this month is the anniversary of other atrocities besides Mrs. Clinton. Atrocities which have either been forgotten or not mentioned at all. And I want to relate a story to you. And it's part of it's about my dad. My dad was an amazing man. He's been dead 30 years. But when he was 26 years old, and my dad was a big man. He was 6 feet 3 inches. He served in the 351st Bomber Group and bombed the Nazis flying out of Polebrook, England. In fact, I've got his mission record. He flew 7 missions from April 8th, 1945 to April 16th, 1945. 70 years ago. He was a tail gunner. His squadron leader, Captain James Stewart, you might know him as the actor Jimmy Stewart. Captain James Stewart was the command leader of the 351st Bomber Group. Anyhow, I'm amazed at the men and women who served in World War II. My dad never made mention of his missions. In fact, he was very humble about it. He rarely spoke of the war at all. But I'm relating it to you simply because it's been 70 years since the end of the war. And next week is the 70th anniversary of the death of the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler and fascism under Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was bludgeoned to death on April 28, 1945, literally Tuesday of next week, 70 years ago. Then drugged through the streets and hung with his wife from a street light. 2 days later, on April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Now, I mention these events because they're linked. They are linked to what is happening today. It's no coincidence that the persecution of Jews and Christians in the Middle East and elsewhere resembles what Adolf Hitler did. No coincidence, absolutely none. In fact, Hitler stated on many occasions his affinity for Islam. Dr. Andrew Bostom, Boston with an M, Bostom, in a piece written in pjmedia.com observes, Albert Speer, who was Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, wrote a memoir of his World War II experiences while serving a 20-year prison sentence imposed by the Nuremberg Tribunal. Speer's narrative includes a discussion which captures Hitler's effusive phrase for Islam, a religion that believed in spreading the faith by the sword and subjugating all nations to that faith. Such a creed was perfectly suited to the Germanic temperament. Hitler, according to Speer's account, repeatedly expressed the conviction that the Mohammedan religion would have been much more compatible to us than Christianity. Why did it have to be Christianity with this meekness and flabbiness? This is Adolf Hitler. Another inspiration for Adolf Hitler, the Armenian genocide of 1915. Yesterday, April 24th, marks 100 years. April 24th, 2015 marks the 100th anniversary of the date officially and appropriately commemorated as the start of the Armenian genocide. Have you ever heard of the Armenian genocide? A jihad genocide. I want you to stay tuned. I've got Dr. Andrew Bostom coming up on the resistance, and you'll learn why April is a decisive month in world history 70 years ago today. And 100 years ago, April 24th, just yesterday, the Armenian genocide when we return. Stay tuned. You've got to hear this.
Let's return to We the People with Forrest Wilson. Once again, here's Forrest.
You know, one of the things I noticed in our commercial break, one of our commercials lists our website as We the People 1786, I think it is, 1786.org. It's We the People 1787.org, We the People 1787.org. Just add 1 year to whatever you heard, 1787.org. So we're talking about this Armenian massacre. Yesterday was the official anniversary, 100-year anniversary that marked this massacre of Armenians during an Islamic jihad. And I see here where yesterday in The Hill, Kim Kardashian calls on Obama to label Armenian massacre genocide. I hadn't heard that. I bet you a lot of people hadn't heard that. But this is being reported by The Guardian, by the Associated Press, April 21st, 2015. Barack Obama will not label 1915 massacre of Armenians a genocide. U.S. President abandons campaign promise to acknowledge genocide of Armenians by Ottoman Turks due to opposition from the State Department. I guess he means our State Department. I mean, sometimes I really struggle when I read the headlines and I understand what our own people are doing to this country. President Barack Obama will once again stop short of calling the 1915 massacre of Armenians a genocide, prompting anger and disappointment from those who have been pushing him to fulfill a campaign promise and use the politically fraught term on the 100th anniversary of the killings this week. My next guest, Dr. Andrew Bostom, an expert on Islam and Sharia, author of Iran's Final Solution for Israel, The Legacy of Jihad and the Shiite Islamic Jew Hatred in Iran. Dr. Bostom, welcome to The Resistance. How are you, sir?
Fine, thanks for having me on.
So what do you make of Barack Obama on the 100th anniversary refusing to acknowledge this massacre of Armenians at the hands of Islamist jihadists?
Well, it's a long-standing pattern, unfortunately. There have been House resolutions introduced, for 30 years now, and none of them have passed. And really, the source of the problem is this delusive belief that somehow Turkey is an ally. You know, Turkey has never been a reliable ally. It wasn't a reliable ally during World War II. There's a wonderful study of this called The Evasive Neutral. It sparingly provided some token troops during the Korea campaign, but it wasn't really a reliable ally against the Soviets either. It certainly is not a reliable ally against the global jihad, and yet the lobby somehow has managed to convince generations now of policymakers that somehow we should deny the jihad genocide of the Armenians and consider Turkey to be an ally. And Obama is just the latest example. Now, to his credit, President Reagan, at least, in his usual forthright manner, labeled the genocide a genocide. But in terms of any, binding resolutions, they were around during his era too, and they never got out of the Congress. In Obama's case, it's particularly, leave it to Obama, it's particularly egregious because a video has recently reemerged from 2008 where Samantha Power, at the time, his foreign policy advisor for the 2008 Obama campaign, deliberately made a video which she pitched to the Armenian community, telling them how he was such a strong advocate of their cause, they could have total trust in him to finally push through the diplomatic barbed wire and recognize the genocide as a genocide. So it's kind of a delicious evidence of the hypocrisy to see this video reemerge in the last week or so.
Well, Dr. Bostom, I know a lot of people listening have probably never heard of the Armenian genocide of 1915. Kind of, if you will, give us an overview of what happened and what the conditions were at the time.
Yeah, well, it was a classical jihad. And really, you must forgive me. I don't mean to be critical, but we can't use a term. It's silly to use a term like Islamism to describe what was going on. It was a classical jihad. Turkey was the leading advocate of traditional caliphate-based Islam. So to sort of retrospectively call it Islamist just totally misses the point. Turkey was a very mainstream champion of Islam in that era, and we have to continue to look at it that way. But in the years building up to the World War I genocide, going back to the 19th century, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, was receding. It suffered a series of military defeats during the 19th century at the hand of identifiably Christian powers, so France, Britain, Russia in particular. And as a result of the treaties that were signed so they could maintain some of their empire's integrity, the Ottoman Empire's integrity, the Turks were supposed to grant religious equality, and certainly political equality to their non-Muslim minorities, predominantly Christian. And so there were a series of so-called reforms. They were called the Tanzimat reforms. And they began in 1839, and they continued all the way, literally almost until the end of the 19th century. And the gist of the reforms was that the religious inequality mandated by the Sharia, by Islamic law, was going to be eliminated, so that the Armenians, in particular, the largest Christian minority, could be full-fledged citizens of the Islamic empire, of the Ottoman Empire. And these reforms were never enacted. And so over a period of 40 years, the Armenians patiently waited for these reforms to be enacted, and they began to petition the Ottoman Sultan and his administration. And just by virtue of asking that these reforms, or these alleged reforms, be implemented, that was considered treasonous. In other words, it was a basic breach of the Sharia itself, which is that the non-Muslim minorities are subjugated and are judged by, in terms of the Sharia, as less than equal. And to simply demand that sort of right is a breach of the Sharia and really mandates, according to Islamic law, that their pact of protection be abrogated and the jihad be waged against them. So we begin to see periodic massacres. There was a huge series of massacres between 1894 and 1896 where 200,000 Armenians were slaughtered based upon calls to jihad. There was a change of administration which was supposed to be more secular leaning with the deposing of Sultan Abdul Hamid in 1909. Even in that period, there was another series of massacres, particularly around the city of Adana. And then during World War I, under the cover of World War I, a whole series of jihad proclamations were issued. Now, some were against the Allies.
Dr. Bostom, I want to get into those. Can you hold on? Because I want to bring you back after the break, and we want to take it from that point. You're listening to The Resistance. My guest, Dr. Andrew Bostom, Islam and Sharia, talking about the Armenian genocide of 1915. We'll be back in just a moment.
Let's return to We the People with Forrest Wilson. Once again, here's Forrest.
You know, I'm just amazed. Kim Kardashian must be of Armenian descent, and she's asked the president to apparently call this massacre a genocide. We're talking with Dr. Andrew Bostom, an expert on Islam and Sharia, author of Iran's Final Solution for Israel, The Legacy of Jihad and Shiite Islamic Jew Hatred in Iran. So you're leading up to this event in 1915, and apparently you mentioned something that was interesting. These Armenians were seeking some sort of religious equality. Is that correct?
Well, those were the terms of the treaties that the Ottomans were forced to sign when they had suffered a whole series of military defeats during the 19th century, significant military defeats at the hands of European powers, France, Britain, and Russia in particular. And because those, in that era at least, those countries represented Christian powers, identifiably Christian powers, they had concerns for the Christian minorities and for the slaughters that had taken place against Christian minorities, for example, the Greeks and the Serbs during the 19th century. And they wanted protections to be ensured for the religious minorities that remained within the Ottoman Empire. The Armenians were the biggest Christian minority, and there was supposed to be specific reforms of the Sharia, of Islamic law, which would improve the lot of these Christian minorities that were very discriminated against per the Sharia, and essentially make them equal citizens of the Ottoman Empire. And so that's all the Armenians were asking for. And they were actually quite rather patient in asking for this, because the first round of reforms dated back to 1839, and at the end of the Russo-Turkish War and through the treaties of the late 1870s, they still weren't being granted these rights.
And up to that point, when you speak of what the Sultan Abdul Hamid. He had massacred, this is prior to 1915, about 250,000 of these Armenian Christians. And
in 1894 to 1896. Yeah, and again, it was on the basis of them having the temerity to simply request the equal rights that they were supposed to have had at that point, almost 50 years earlier.
So what really precipitated this event beginning in 1915, the official date being April 24th?
Well, there was a conscious decision made to ethnically cleanse, particularly the Armenian minority, but the other Christian minorities as well, to consolidate what was left of the Ottoman Empire. It was an Islamization, Turkification program under the so-called Young Turks. Now, the administration at that point was sort of nationalistic, secular-leaning to a certain extent, but also even one of the triumvirate of leaders at that point, Ottoman leaders, was a pretty much a fundamentalist Muslim. But regardless of the leadership ideology, they knew that the way to rouse the masses was to appeal to traditional Islam, to the Sharia, to the fact that these infidels were escaping the lot in life that they were supposed to live under the Sharia, and so you see calls for jihad, not calls for Turkification, calls for jihad by religious leaders, high-level religious leaders, and local preachers as well. Some of the calls for jihad against the Christian European powers, like two directed at Indian Muslims, for example, were unsuccessful, but the vulnerable populations, like the Armenians, who were relatively defenseless, those calls were highly, quote unquote, successful, and that's really what led to these massacres, these deportations and massacres.
And when you say deportations, were they literally trying to get these people out of the area, or were they
Yeah, there were massive deportations from the heart of Anatolia, central modern Turkey, into the desert wastelands where they died of exposure. And the idea that this isn't well documented is also preposterous. I mean, one of the leaders of the Ottoman Empire at this time, again, it was a triumvirate trio of rulers. His memoir, Talat Pasha, his memoir became available within the last 25 years, and finally got a lot of it translated into English even in the last 10 years. And you could see his own figures. That he was the head of the Interior Ministry, so he knew all these details. You could say, well, he estimates 972,000 Armenians were deported. And then he has another figure that 1,150,000, quote unquote, disappeared. I mean, even under pressure from the Allies after World War I, there were military tribunals, Ottoman military tribunals, which basically found leadership guilty for a centralized, what we would call a genocide, although the word hadn't been invented at that time. But of course, after the period where Ataturk takes over, these records were all sealed. Those records too have slowly come out to a certain extent, but even the news reports in the Turkish press at that time, have always been available to people. And that was the gist of the finding of these military tribunals, that, parties were responsible for organizing this centralized mass killing. And then Lemkin comes along in relation to the Holocaust and retroactively goes back and terms the Armenian killings the first genocide, and that's how and so he was using that as an example, and then it was applied to the Holocaust, of course. So I don't understand the debate about this, and on top of that, we have our own ambassadors and local level consuls during World War I stationed throughout the Ottoman Empire who were eyewitnesses to a lot of this, and their records have been available, and really that's the basis, the ultimate basis for these House resolutions, saying we don't need the British records, the German records, the French records, the Ottoman records, the Armenian accounts. We have our own diplomatic records of what was going on. Eyewitnesses that were U.S. citizens and diplomats, and we should go with that record and declare it a genocide.
And these killings, I mean, we're not talking about putting a bullet in them. A lot of these were head choppings. They'd chop off limbs. They'd leave them to die with. Many of them, I understand, begged to be shot. Is this correct?
Yes. It's just gruesome. And by the way, what the bitter irony is that remnant populations were last summer and then through now being attacked by the ISIS jihadists. There was a very plaintive account from an Armenian woman who had in her 50s who had escaped from Mosul. In the past year, from the jihadist assaults there, and she said she felt like she was living the history that her ancestors had described. I mean, it's just a nightmare, and I think that's the other aspect of this. The part of the House resolution that disappoints me is that there's no mention of the ideological basis for this, the jihad basis for this, and I think this is a terrible, terrible flaw. Although, if it's got to be done in stages, better that it at least be recognized as a genocide than not at all. But I think it's a terrible failing. And, as someone who's descended from European Jews, virtually the entire European Jewish community was touched in one way or another by the Holocaust. And, at least we have some spiritual consolation that first of all, the event, other than lunatics, and rabid anti-Semites, is recognized as an historical event, i.e. the Holocaust. And also the Nazi ideology, which inspired it, has been thoroughly denounced, again, other than by lunatics. My Armenian brethren are not getting either, as far as I'm concerned. They're certainly not getting the recognition that this was a jihad, and they're getting less than appropriate recognition for the fact that this was a genocide.
Well, Dr. Bostom, I mean, these parallels are really stunning, because you've got the State Department somehow resisting President Obama potentially discussing this as a genocide. This sounds like it sounds like what you just described from the 1900s.
Yeah, I mean, there's always I don't understand this need to appease Turkey, and it's really not new. I mean, for heaven's sake, the Allies during at the end of World War I even were still figuring out ways to appease Turkey at various different levels. I mean, some were more aggressive in condemning Turkey, but it's just unbelievable. Even there was a great novel by Franz Werfel called 40 Days at Musadak, and it was really written in the late 1930s as a warning to European Jewry and to Europeans about using the Armenian genocide, or whatever it was called at that point, mass killings, as an example for what the Nazis were building up to. But it's based on an historical event that took place when a small group of Armenians actually on a mountaintop offered resistance that they could, and were eventually rescued by the Allies. But making a movie out of that, literally since Werfel's novel in the late 1930s, has been blocked by the Turkish lobby, against Hollywood. There have been many attempts by Hollywood it's a very compelling novel if you ever read it. And that's how powerful this denial has been, and the Turkish lobby has been.
Now, these events in 1915 really inspired someone else, and that would have been Adolf Hitler. And you write in your piece in Pajama Media about how Adolf Hitler used this as kind of a roadmap for what he planned for the Jews of Germany.
Yeah, he was very open about it in a speech that was given, right after the secret, pact was signed with the Soviet Union, the non-aggression pact, and then allowed Hitler, free access and rolling into Poland. Right before that brutal invasion of Poland, he said something to the effect that who after all remembers the extermination of the Armenians? And Hitler was very much enamored of jihadism, thought that Islam was a martial religion, actually thought that Christianity was very flabby, and believe it or not, according to certain accounts, Hitler would have preferred if Charles Martel had not thrown back, the Arab Muslim jihadists to the 8th century, and Germany had been Islamized, because the Germans would have gotten Islam right. It was a religion that was more suited to the warlike German temperament. I mean, this is how enamored Hitler was apparently of Islam. But regardless, he certainly saw the slaughter of the Armenians as a precedent.
I've had a lot of guests on this program that have accused Barack Obama of being a Muslim and being sympathetic to the Muslim cause and jihad. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. The record is the very straightforward, non-inflammatory record is very clear that he had a nominal Muslim upbringing as a child. Even Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times, in interviewing him, writes about how Obama referred to the call to prayer as such a lovely sound, a romantic, image from his childhood. So he certainly has favorable impressions of Islam, and frankly, that's understandable. I mean, it's part of his upbringing. But I think what's more dangerous in terms of his attitudes is his hard left orientation, which sees and including and now it's very clear that Franklin Marshall Davis, a rather dangerous communist, was an important influence on him as a young man. And I think that actually says more about this streak of anti-Americanism, anti-colonialism, anti-Western civilization that seems to pervade him. And, you know, Islam has long been the favored religion of such types, and is seen as a bulwark against, whatever, Western imperialism. So I think it may have more to do with that. Although in Obama, you do have this unique situation, given his childhood background and his romantic attachment to Islam.
You're right about the fate of non-Muslims who survive jihad and live under Sharia. Talk about that in the final closing moments here. Yeah,
essentially, again, that's why these reforms, these failed reforms, were put upon the Ottoman Empire when it was suffering military defeats in these various treaties, because unencumbered by such things, the Sharia applied to non-Muslims is brutally discriminatory in terms of penal law, in terms of taxation, in terms of right to practice religion the way a Christian or the way a Jew or the way a Zoroastrian would practice their own religion unencumbered by Islam. And there's no freedom of conscience. There's no freedom of speech. It's a very, very religious totalitarian system. And it also has this peculiarity that there's collective punishment. If payment of this poll tax is not made on time, if a non-Muslim is perceived as insulting Islam, the whole community could be at risk, because that's a condition to resume the jihad against the community. It's a very, very tenuous and humiliating form of existence for non-Muslims under the Sharia. And we see it today. It's evident today. Even with these much ballyhooed reforms that the Sisi has been burbling about in Egypt, the Coptic population there is still beset. None of their churches that were devastated almost 20 months ago have been rebuilt. They're still being prosecuted for blasphemy, and this is supposed to be the best of the best examples that we're given.
Dr. Bostom, I really appreciate you coming on today. Your book is Iran's Final Solution for Israel, The Legacy of Jihad and Shiite Islamic Jew Hatred in Iran. If you want to read Dr. Bostom's article on PJ Media, it's Congress Must Recognize Jihad Genocide of the Armenians. I hope you'll go read it. His website is andrewbostom.org. Sounds like Boston, except it's spelled with an M. Again, Dr. Bostom, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Let's return to We the People with Forrest Wilson. Once again, here is Forrest.
So if you want to read tie all this together about this Armenian genocide, you need to go to pjmedia.com, PJ as in pajama, pjmedia.com, and look up Congress Must Recognize Jihad Genocide of the Armenians by Andrew G. Bostom. Dr. Andrew G. Bostom. Definitely worth a read. It will really give you some insight into what's happening today. Because there are parallels to this genocide. We've seen it in World War I, World War II, and now World War III. I want to play a clip for you here before we end the day. Eric Holder has resigned, as you know, and his replacement has been confirmed by the Senate. With a Republican majority in the Senate, we confirm Loretta Lynch. But I guess, have you noticed how at least in the last 10 or so years, maybe longer, all of our attorney generals have really had some identity. There hasn't been a white male attorney general in some time. Have you noticed that? I think it started with the big tall woman, the lesbian lady. What was her name? Yeah, I can't remember it either. Then there was Alberto Gonzalez under Bush. And then I just don't recall a white guy. And it just seems like it's always somebody from the LGBT crowd, a black person, a Hispanic person. Look, that's all fine and well, but they just all seem to have an axe to grind against the Constitution and the American people. Anyways, I want you to play Loretta Lynch and the comments by Mike Lee and his questioning under testimony when they were vetting Miss Lynch. Play it.
Are you aware that there's a a program called Operation Choke Point within the Department of Justice. And that through this program, the Department of Justice and some other federal law enforcement agencies have, on some occasions, put financial pressure on legal businesses, including hardworking Americans who happen to be involved in the business of selling firearms and ammunition, by essentially telling banks not to do business with them.
I'm generally familiar with the name Operation Choke Point. And my understanding of it with respect to the Department of Justice current work, again, I haven't been involved in either the implementation or the creation of it, but my general understanding of it is that it looks to target financial institutions that are involved in perpetrating frauds upon consumers. And where there might be a financial institution that is facilitating, for example, consumer bank accounts being looted, or consumers.
You can turn her off. Okay, she understands what it is, and she goes on to describe what it is after saying that she wasn't familiar with it. The point being that Operation Choke Point, the goal of these financial institutions is to impede gun dealers from providing you with your Second Amendment right, otherwise known as a firearm. So now we've got somebody who is probably going to continue the legacy of Eric Holder and continue to squash the Constitution and the Second Amendment. So my question is, why do you think we have had so many identity politics or had so much identity politics involved in the selection of our attorney generals? And really, I don't care what color the person is. I don't care what gender the person is. I don't care what their sexual preferences are. It just seems that so many of these people that we have appointed through our Senate, I say we the people, it doesn't seem like our Senate gives a damn about what we think about these people in the Second Amendment. But my point is, so many of them just seem to be these activists that either have gun control in the brain, abortion, or some other thing to do and impose upon we the people. It's just an observation. Anyways, I just wanted to bring that up in the final minutes of the show. And you are listening to The Resistance, AM 600, FM 100.3. We've got a couple of minutes left. 902-222-TALK, 904-222-8255. We are out of time. I'm sorry. We'll try to take some calls next week. Look, I promise. It's just we've got a packed hour here. Thanks for tuning in. Forrest Wilson, your host, The Resistance. I'll see you next week.